Hey everybody, I'm back with another video, and this one is slightly different than the other videos that I've made, just because this is not a sound test. There aren't really any videos, so to speak. This is mostly about soldering. Now, I figure that a lot of people already know how to solder, and if not, I really suggest you learn. But this will not be a how-to video, but more so a few tips and tricks that I've learned and that I think are very helpful. Now, this does not mean that these tips and tricks are not covered in other videos, just because there's so many good soldering videos, not only when it comes to the keyboard hobby, but soldering in general. So in order to learn soldering, and if you want to watch a guide on learning how to solder, I do not suggest you watch this video, because I will not be going over how to solder, so to speak. This will only be a video of a few tips and tricks. So, without further ado, let's get started. Alright, so I have 8 soldering tips and tricks that I want to share with you all today. And keep in mind, this is not the most optimal way to solder. This is just my opinion, and I'm sure that you can solder just fine without listening to some or all of these tips and tricks. If it works for you, and you don't damage anything, then it's fine. And I don't know everything when it comes to soldering, especially when it comes to keyboard soldering, so don't take my word for it. I think experience is the best way to learn something, and even if you don't listen or watch this video at all, and you just watch a soldering how-to guide, I'm sure you'll be fine. But without further ado, let's go to step 1, and that is check and test your PCBs. So today, I was fortunate enough to get my ISO GR from Canon Keys. Let me bring this up to the camera. Actually, let me use my digital microscope here so I can show you all a closer look of what I'm seeing. So basically, when I'm talking about checking your PCB, I'm first talking about making sure if it looks fine aesthetically. See if there are any damages to the PCB itself. Top looks fine. And what I mean by damages is sometimes you'll see broken or sheared off diodes, or you'll see some other sort of damage, which we don't want. I mean, I guess as long as everything works, that's fine. But I recommend just giving your PCB a quick look over. And if it passes the eye test, then you're good. And step number 2 is testing your PCB. Now what we're going to need for that is we're going to need some pliers. Forgive me, my neighbor is mowing the lawn. And what we basically want to do is we want to put the pliers over our switch would go. So if I were inserting a switch into this PCB, I would basically put my pliers into the holes that I'd place my switch legs in. Not the plastic switch legs, but the metal contacts, basically where you're going to solder the switch legs in. When we plug this in, since it has USB-C, what we're going to do is we're going to pull up the software that you would use to remap your PCB. So in this case, I'll use VIA because it's VIA compatible. You can use Vial if it's VIA compatible. If it has a proprietary software and doesn't work with VIA or Vial, you can use that as well. But we're basically just going to go into whatever software you use to change things on the PCB. Whether it's change colors, whether it's changing the key map instead of the page up key, maybe you want to change it to volume up, things like that. So we're in VIA because it's VIA compatible. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my tweezers into where I'd put the switch legs, the metal switch legs. So 1, 2. And as you can see, in VIA, it lights up. That's good. I have a 60% PCB here from Paramount Keyb. It's their GXD60 PCB. So again, I'm going to take a quick glance and just make sure that it passes the eye test. I don't see any damage on the front. And I don't see any missing or sheared or broken diodes or anything on the back. Now, this is more so in the event that you see some damage, because if you solder a PCB and you realize that it's damaged, not because of your soldering, chances are you're not going to be able to get it replaced or refunded. Most companies and vendors want you to check your soldered PCBs before you actually start soldering, so they know that it's not something that you did and it's just, damaged in transit or something they overlooked when they were QCing the PCB. So in my opinion, you should always check your PCB before you start soldering. Obviously you don't have to, but a couple minutes to make sure that it works versus realizing that it doesn't work after you soldered it and you can't get a replacement or a refund, I think it's well worth it. In this situation, we don't have onboard USB-C support, so we're going to need to grab a daughter board. Just have one right here. We're going to connect the daughter board with a JST cable, and on the other end, connect it to the PCB. Make sure there you go, nice and slow. You're not bending any pins. There we go. Now we're gonna plug this into our computer. As you can see, it has backlight, RGB. I'm not a big backlight or RGB fan, so I'm gonna turn it off once we get into VIA. So we're gonna pull up VIA again. I'm gonna do the same exact thing as I did with the ISO-GR PCB, and I'm gonna test where each of my switches are gonna go into. I'm not going to keep this all into the recording, but I'm gonna fast forward and I'm gonna show you what it looks like in VIA after I test all the keys. So, see you then. All right, so tip number 2, after you checked and tested your PCB and made sure that everything looks good and works well, make sure you have the time to solder and are in the mood to solder. Now, this isn't a hard and fast rule, obviously. Sometimes I've gotten to situations where I just want to solder real quick, get it done with, and I can work on the rest of my build. But honestly, especially in a hobby where 99% of the time you're in the hobby to enjoy it, honestly, I would make sure that you have the time to solder and are in the mood to solder. I don't know about you guys, but if I feel like I don't want to do something and I feel like it's a chore, I get moody, I get irate, and sometimes I don't even do a good enough job. I don't want that to happen when I'm soldering. I want to enjoy soldering. The reason why I like to solder is because it adds to the whole process. Similar to making Legos, I have fun building Legos and playing with Legos, but I don't have fun if somebody just hands me a fully built Lego set. It's all part of the process. Soldering is just yet another part of building a keyboard, and you may really feel like you're building something with your own hands. And if you're in a good mood to solder, then generally you won't make as many mistakes. Put on some headphones, put in some earbuds, listen to some music, or even watch some keyboard stream, or do something that makes you really relaxed and puts you in the mood to solder. All right, you've checked and tested your PCBs. You made sure that you have time to solder and you aren't rushing and you're in the mood to solder. So we're on to tip number 3. Make sure you have all the soldering equipment that you need available. Well, honestly, it's more than just having it available. Obviously, you can't solder if you don't have the equipment, but more so, make sure you set everything up beforehand, before you start soldering. So for me, I like to start off with a nice silicone work mat, because I know that if I accidentally drop solder on the work mat, it's easy to wipe off. It has a couple cubbies where I could put stuff in. It's non-slip, and if I happen to touch my soldering tip or any part of the soldering iron that's hot onto the work mat, I know it's not going to burn or melt. Make sure you have a fume extractor as well, because you don't want to breathe in those solder fumes, especially when you use leaded solder, which I always do. Make sure you got your soldering iron, because how else are you going to solder? Also, make sure that you have the right tip. I'm not going to go into this in depth right now, but later on I am, because this single-handedly changed the game for me when it comes to solder. You got your tip tinner, which you basically use to tin your tip and make sure that your soldering tip is nice. I also like to clean off my solder, any excess solder, with one of these little brush cleany thingies. I'll basically use a tip tinner, tin my tip, wipe off any excess when I'm soldering, wipe off any excess, add some more solder, and so on and so forth. And last, but certainly not least, your actual solder. I recommend a good solder. I know you can get away with cheap solders, but I've been using this Kester solder 6337 and I haven't had any complaints. It's been close to a year since I started learning how to solder, and I still have a bunch of solder left for 20 bucks or whatever I paid for it. So I say invest in a good quality solder. Yes, I use leaded solder. That's why I make sure I use a fume extractor and I'm soldering in a well-ventilated area. You can use unleaded solder, but since I've never used unleaded solder or lead-free solder, I'm not going to tell you how to use it or what brands to buy and things like that. I'm only going to try and tell you tips and tricks based off things that I've done or things that I have. Also, this is not a necessity. It's just something that I like to do. After I finish soldering, I use some isopropyl alcohol and some cotton swabs, basically to clean from any splats or any flux, leftover flux and things like that. This is not required at all, and something I like to do to clean the back of my PCB. Again, this is not necessarily, this is just something that I like to do for the aesthetics of the PCB. 9 times out of 10, you're not even going to look at the back of the PCB, but again, it's just something I like to do. Something else that also goes along with tip 3 regarding make sure you have all your equipment available is check your switches and your plate if you're not doing a plateless. So what I mean by that is, first of all, before you start anything, make sure that if you're using a plate, that it fits onto your PCB and is compatible with your PCB. Obviously, you should be doing this even before you get set up to solder, because why would you buy a plate that is not compatible with your PCB? But hey, I've had situations where I start soldering and I realize, oh shoot, this plate only supports 6.25U, or this plate doesn't support Sangen bottom row, and things like that. It's always good to double check. Basically, this is going to happen anyways once you put the switches in before you start soldering. But yeah, make sure your PCB and plate are compatible. The other thing that I like to do, and again, this is just something that I like to do, is to make sure that my switch legs are all straight. Before you even start soldering and before you even put them into your PCB, I like to make sure and check that all the legs and pins on my switches are straight. Also, make sure you have enough space to solder. All right, well, I realized that I combined tips 3 and 4 together. Basically, tip 3 was make sure that you have all your soldering equipment available and set up, and tip 4 was make sure you have enough space to solder. So that was technically 3 and 4. So tip 5 now is regarding your switches. So make sure that your switches are installed flush and correctly into your PCB. Why is it important to make sure your switches are installed flush and correctly into the PCB? Both for plateless builds and for plated builds. The reason is because, say you put in all your switches into the PCB and you start soldering, and you finish soldering, and you realize that some switches are crooked or not installed correctly into the PCB. Not only will you notice when you're putting on keycaps, but it's going to look bad. So take your time. Again, don't rush, and make sure that you're installing switches correctly into the PCB. I also wanted to bring something up real quickly. Say, for example, you solder and you realize that one of your switches are crooked. Or sometimes people even use this method and do it on purpose, just because it's going to be easier for them to solder on a plateless build, solder on a half plate build, solder with 3-pin switches, or realize that they'll have to come back and touch it up anyways, so they may as well just solder one leg. So basically what you're going to do, I'm going to turn on my digital microscope here. So if you realize your switches are crooked, you can always heat up your already soldered switch legs and press your switches in from the other side so they sit flush on the PCB. So what I would do is, let's just say, for example, this is the A key. So what I'd do is I'd see which side the switch was crooked on, or you could just do both sides, it doesn't matter. I'll reheat the switch leg, I'll reheat the solder joint, So I'm not adding more solder, I'm just reheating it. And on the other side, I'll press down on the A key. Sometimes you'll hear a satisfying click, or sometimes you'll just see it automatically become uncrooked. If this switch leg doesn't work, I'll try this switch leg. And I'll press on the other side. So I'm pressing on the keycap or I'm pressing on the switch. It depends whether I have a keycap on that switch already or if I haven't put keycaps on. Cherries or Gaterons or other switches whose legs sit tightly into the PCB, this is less of an issue. But sometimes, when you install a switch into the PCB and you turn over the PCB to start soldering, the switch falls out. So I'll show you an example with these Zepsody blue bonnets. You can see with these cherry switches, when I place them into the PCB and I turn the PCB over, they don't fall out. With these Zepsody blue bonnets, I'm going to do the same exact thing. It's into the PCB. When I turn it over, it falls out. I basically almost always use cherries or switches that sit flush into the PCB and don't fall out. But there are two tips that I want to bring up if you ever have a situation where your switches fall out of the PCB when you try and turn it over to start soldering. So you checked and tested your PCB, you made sure you have time to solder and are in the mood, you have all your soldering equipment available and ready to go, you're making sure you have enough space and you're soldering on a surface that you don't mind damaging, you've installed your switches flush and correctly into the PCB, you don't have any legs, switch legs that are bent, and you made sure by checking the back of the PCB that all the switch legs are good to go, but you have a situation where your switches do not sit flush, do not sit tightly into your plate and PCB. To keep the switches and plate together onto the PCB while I turn it around. Usually I'll use 3 to 4 different rubber bands. So I'm not going to have this X pattern that I have here because I just have one rubber band, but I'll have a rubber band here, here, and here. For 60%, I usually use 3. For 65s and larger, I use 4 or as many as it takes. Now, this is super helpful if you're doing a plateless build or if you're doing a half plate build, because for a plateless build, you don't have a plate where your switches are sitting in contact with the PCB. So if you flip it over, they're all going to fall out. If you have a half plate, the alphas are going to be basically naked. So when you flip it over, the alphas are going to fall out. And you can use 3 to 4 rubber bands and it'll keep the PCB, plate, and switches all together. Obviously, when you're soldering, you have to move the rubber band or else you're going to solder the rubber band, which you don't want to do, obviously. But hey, it's better than having your switches falling out. Now, if you're doing a half plate build where the alphas are naked, or a plateless build where you don't have a plate at all, and you're using loose switches, or if you're using 3-pin switches in a plateless build, or a half plate build for the alphas, that's where things get a little tricky. In those situations, I recommend using a different plate like we talked about to hold together the switches onto the PCB. If you aren't able to do that, honestly, you can find some other flat surface like a cardboard box, a strip of a cardboard box, or some other flat surface. And what you do is you basically line up the switches. If your cardboard box is small enough and thin enough, you can do the rubber band method and just put the rubber band between the cardboard and the PCB. Or in a pinch, you're just going to have to solder very carefully while applying pressure to the back of the PCB. Tip 6 is to make sure you're using the right tip for the size of the pad. Now, for me, this was huge. Honestly, soldering is mostly about heat transfer. If you're not transferring heat correctly, you're going to solder with cold joints, basically what happens when your solder balls up, or you can have solder splatters. So let me show you what I mean about having the right tip for the solder pad. So when soldering, you want to place your tip between the soldering pad and your switch leg. So basically like this. However, you want to use the right tip. So if you can see here, I'm only touching a small portion of the pad and the switch leg. So as you can see, yes, I can make connection between the pad and my switch leg, But look at the amount of surface area that this type of tip can touch. Using a tip that I personally like to use, which is a chisel tip, look and see how much surface area the chisel tip touches. Way more than that smaller conical tip. Basically, heat from my soldering iron is transferring to the PCB a lot faster and a lot more evenly. This results in no cold soldering joints where your solder bubbles up, and minimal splatting. Basically, I couldn't figure out what was wrong because I was soldering at a normal temperature, not too high, not too low. I was making sure I was feeding my solder real slowly. I was making sure that I wasn't forcing anything and I was taking my time, and I was still getting solder splatter, and I was still getting cold soldering joints. Well, turns out I was using too small of a tip. Let me see if I can bring the conical tip back here. There. So as you can see, the difference between the chisel tip and the conical tip. Now, this doesn't mean that you want to have too big of a tip, because let me show you what it looks like when your tip is too big. All right, that's not good, because not only are you heating the pad, you're also heating the PCB around it, which can lead to damage if you leave this tip in contact with the PCB for too long. Not too big, not too small, just right. Obviously, you can solder correctly without splatting, without having cold soldering joints, and transfer heat just fine without a chisel tip. I'm just saying this is what helped me alleviate all that splatting in cold soldering. And last but not least, I tricked you guys. Tips 7 and 8, not a thing. Just take your time. Apparently I can't count. But anyways, yeah, appreciate you watching this video. Hopefully some of these tips and tricks will help you. Honestly, like I said at the beginning of the video, this is not anything new. This is not groundbreaking. This is something that I'm sure people already know or inherently know and just do automatically. These are just things that helped me. And if it can help somebody else, then I'm happy. Anyways, I'm going to leave it off here with some soldering footage. I have the ISO GR to solder, and I also have this GXT60 PCB to solder. I'm going to leave some portions of the soldering video at normal speed, just so you can see what soldering looks like. Appreciate everybody watching, and have a great day.